Welcome to the Zoffy for Wednesday, June 10th. And today we're going to be talking to Robert Hornung, who is the new CEO of the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. And we're going to be talking about wind and solar and how that will fit into the Canadian power grid. So welcome to the Zoffy, Robert.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Now, we've had a couple of Zoffies where we've had guests in, like Professor Tim Weiss from the University of Alberta, to talk about power generation grid issues before. And there's a lot of interest amongst our readers and amongst folks who come up to the Zoffies about wind and solar, what the future is, and how they can be integrated into the Canadian grid to displace the 20% or so of coal that still remains. Maybe we could start with, if you wouldn't mind giving us kind of an overview of wind and solar in Canada right now.
Well, sure. And I might start, though, by saying that the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, the new association that has been created through the merger of the wind and solar associations, actually has a mandate to look at both wind, solar, and energy storage. And I mention that because it is relevant for your question around integration. But in terms of where we sit globally and what's been happening in Canada, I mean, in my mind, wind energy is quite a Canadian success story. Over the last 10 years, there's been more installed capacity of wind energy built in Canada than any other source of electricity generation. We are the 9th largest producer of wind energy in the world, a statistic that doesn't get referenced too often. If we look around, we now can make a very credible case that wind energy is actually the lowest cost source of new generation available in Canada today. So that provides, I think, a lot of optimism for the future. Solar is on a very similar trend. It has grown quite significantly. Most of that growth has been concentrated in Ontario, but that growth is now starting to expand, especially at the residential level and in Alberta going forward. And again, the costs have also been coming down very, very significantly there as well. So our mandate as an association is to try and ensure that wind, solar, and energy storage are kind of playing a central role in the transformation of the energy mix going forward. And I think the conditions are ripe to allow that to happen.
One question I've got, Robert, is the fact that Canada has 60% of its power from hydro. Does that mean that actually positions the Canadian grid really well to integrate more intermittent power?
Yeah, certainly reservoir hydro provides a really tremendous opportunity to serve as a great partner for variable generation sources like wind and solar. And in fact, we are part of a group called the Canadian Council on Renewable Electricity, which will involve our association, Water Power Canada, Marine Renewables Canada. And I would often say that if we're going to deal with climate change, we need to decarbonize our grid. If we're going to decarbonize our grid, we have to look at the resources. Canada is blessed with an unbelievable diversity of wind, solar, water resources across the country. And frankly, if there's any country that should be able to move to 100% non-emitting grid, it should be Canada. And hydropower will play an important role in that, both in terms of some new generation, but also serving as a balance or partner to expansion of wind and solar going forward.
I have a question that's always, I don't think I've had a satisfactory answer yet, so I'll ask it of you. From my point of view, the energy transition is really about electrifying the global economy. We're going to electrify transportation, electrify industrial processes, or maybe it'll be hydrogen, but we're going to take the fossil fuels out. So that means I would assume a huge increase in renewable energy generation. And how do can we build enough capacity using wind and solar to meet the demands of electrification?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at any study that has looked at deep decarbonization pathways in Canada, they all envision that we'll have to increase the size of the electricity grid by at least doubling. Some would even go so far as tripling. And that's a lot of new investment and new infrastructure. I mentioned earlier that I think Canada is extremely well positioned in terms of the quantity of the resource. Wind and solar resources are available. They're available in every part of the country. It's not geographically specific, so that also provides some assistance in that regard. But it's really the synergies between these different technologies that provide the bulk of the opportunity for Canada, I think, going forward. And at the end of the day, as I said earlier, if there's any country in the world that can move to do this, and frankly, from our perspective, Canada should be striving to be a global leader, not just in decarbonizing the grid, but moving forward with that electrification. It's going to happen everywhere if we're serious about climate change, and we should be positioning ourselves to be leaders in knowledge, technology that we can share and export to other countries as well.
What are some of the business opportunities that are being created with these, new renewable low-cost technologies?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, within the industry itself, you're seeing phenomenal growth. So we talked a little bit earlier about the growth of wind in Canada. In the United States, I'm just referencing this because I have the statistics from there, but over the last 5 years, if you look at the fastest growing occupations, in the top 5, you're going to find wind turbine technician, solar installer. There's a tremendous amount of opportunity there going forward. And I think the other area where we're seeing this is in terms of, because of the declining costs that we're seeing, you're also seeing a dramatic increase in the customer base that is interested in procuring this energy. So you have one of the key drivers for renewables development in Alberta, in the United States, increasingly in Europe, is corporate procurement. Companies like the General Motors, Johnson & Johnson, Google, everybody who are making sustainability commitments and then going out and procuring renewables to meet those commitments. Yes, because they're non-emitting, but primarily because they're low cost. You also see a growing desire from people to essentially self-supply, to explore opportunities to, again, take control of where their electricity is coming from. And that's where you're seeing fairly explosive growth, particularly in the US, in terms of residential solar as well. So I think these are, it's not a supply-driven sort of industry. It's increasingly a demand-driven industry, and I only see that demand increasing going forward.
What kind of costs are we looking at in the future? I mean, I referenced Lazard a few minutes ago, and according to Lazard, at the bottom end, wind is $28 a megawatt hour, solar is $32 a megawatt hour. That's less than new gas and new coal. But everybody says that the cost curves are still declining. Where do you see those cost curves going over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I don't have quite that accurate a crystal ball in terms of being able to give you a number. I mean, clearly there are still improvements that are coming. And so costs are going to continue to decline, but it's not going to be at the rate that we've seen in the past, the curve that's flattening out now going forward. But the declines we have seen are significant. I mean, Lazard talks about over the last 7 years, 60% declines in the cost of wind, 80% declines in the cost of solar. And as we said, they're now well positioned, as you mentioned, to be cheaper than new gas and new coal. But increasingly, you see a whole bunch of analysts coming forward, Bloomberg and others, who are arguing that we're either today or within the next 5 years going to be at the place where new wind and solar are going to be cheaper than existing coal, and a little bit later existing gas. So the economic drivers to be exploring these technologies and encouraging greater adoption of these technologies are only going to be increasing going forward.
Let's talk a little bit about the role of battery storage in the wind and solar industry. And I have to say that 2 years ago, I was tending more towards Professor Vaclav's Smil view of the energy transition, that it would be more slow and gradual. And it's the rapid development of battery technology that's changed my opinion about that. I think I'm surprised by how energy density has gone up and costs have come down. And I think even the analysts I interview are kind of surprised about that. And then, of course, we see other types of batteries coming into the grid, like flow batteries, vanadium flow batteries, those sorts of things. So if you could give us maybe just an overview of the role that storage plays in the wind and solar's integration into the grid.
Oh, I think it's going to play a critical role when we're looking at the types of, the levels of penetration that we expect wind and solar to move to over time. And you're absolutely right that that's really been facilitated by the dramatic drop we've seen in costs of batteries. course, batteries are not the only form of storage as well, right? There's other forms of storage that are being explored very actively, whether it's compressed air, whether it's, we talked earlier about reservoir hydro. There are all sorts of different ways to do that. And I think, frankly, I think with storage, the issue is less a technology question at this point. The issue is a markets question. You know, do storage technologies, do our electricity market structures and rules actually provide incentives for energy storage to come onto the system and accurately sort of compensate them for the services they're providing to the grid? And I think storage will play a role in two ways. You're going to see an increasing growth, and you're already seeing it in terms of hybrid projects. So wind and solar facilities that actually have batteries on site, for example. But you'll also see storage play a role independent of renewables in terms of standalone projects that just provide grid services that help to facilitate integration, grid stability, and reliability going forward. And I mean, you have a group like Bloomberg now, Bloomberg's New Energy Outlook, arguing that by 2050, 50% of global electricity will come from wind, solar, and storage. And that's driven largely in their analysis by the cost trends and the carbon imperative. So there are some real opportunities there, but again, I would argue in many ways the technology is moving at a rate that we're struggling to keep up with from policy and a market perspective. But to their credit, I think there are system operators and utilities across North America that are really starting to wrestle now with these questions of how to enable this transformation to occur.
Well, let's talk about some of those issues. What do you think are the top 1 or 2 or 3 impediments to further adoption or deep adoption of wind and solar?
Well, I think in the Canadian context, I mean, I'll talk about both the sort of large utility scale kind of projects and also what we call the behind the meter projects, the residential projects and things like that as well. You know, if you look at the drivers that are in place around the world that are pushing renewables forward, so decarbonization, yes, it's a key driver. In Canada, as you mentioned, we're 80% decarbonized in the grid. So it's going to be a key driver in some places, Alberta, Saskatchewan, the Maritimes, less so in other places. Corporate procurement, a key driver in much of the world. You're not able to do that in most of Canada, right? You can do it in the deregulated market in Alberta. Nova Scotia is starting to take some steps in that regard, but in the vertically integrated markets, a corporation doesn't have the option of going and signing a bilateral agreement. So that's again a bit of a barrier there. So at the end of the day, and we're also in many parts of Canada right now, we're still sitting in a situation where we have, frankly, electricity surpluses in place. British Columbia is an example of that. Quebec is just starting to move out of a surplus. Ontario is sitting in a surplus. So these are things that pose barriers in the short term. But I guess the way I would always present it is to say we will need new electricity going forward, new electricity supply. Electrification will be incredibly important in driving that demand going forward. And as that demand emerges, you know, what's going to be a key determinant of what we're going to seek to procure? It's going to have to be clean, non-emitting, and low cost. And that's where these technologies are incredibly well positioned to move forward and deliver. So I think right now we've got a fair bit of experience with these technologies across the country. So yes, there are still regulatory questions in terms of wind and solar that we can work on. Storage is a bit less advanced in that regard, so there's more work to do. And I would also say on the behind the meter side, there's more work to do as well in terms of the regulatory framework. Utilities really wrestling with, okay, if we have all of this new generation coming onto the distribution system, what does that mean? We don't often, a system operator will often say, I can't see that. I don't know what's happening there. How do I manage that? So these are questions that I think are part of active discussion right now. And fortunately, there's a lot of other places in the world we can look to that are moving in this direction as well. And I think as long as we're not trying to solve this in 10 different jurisdictions in Canada by ourselves, and we're actually trying to facilitate collaboration, information sharing, hopefully we can move forward fairly quickly.
Is the fact that in many provinces, the utility is there's a single power utility and it's government owned and it's a natural monopoly. Is that an impediment, or are those natural monopolies now recognizing that they have to change their business model and incorporate more renewables?
I think there's an evolution that's underway. I think historically, in the early days of wind and solar growing in Canada, I think a lot of those utilities took action to procure those technologies because they were directed to do so. So government said, we want to get some wind, hold an RFP, go and do this. I think over time, as these utilities have gained more experience with the technologies and become more comfortable with them, as they've seen the cost drop down, I think now there's more proactive exploration from the utility itself to look at what options there are going forward. I'll single out SaskPower in this regard. I think SaskPower is a utility that is very actively sort of wrestling with the question of, okay, we're phasing out coal. We're trying to find the least cost way to do that while ensuring reliability. And I think they're looking at it from a very open-minded perspective. They're not going in with any sort of set assumptions. And we and other technologies are in there sort of making the case. And I'm quite confident that we'll see significant growth in wind and solar in Saskatchewan as a result of that.
I have a little example I'd like your opinion on. So I interviewed John Ritt, who's the VP of planning for NMAX in Calgary. And he said, think of it like this. In the 90s, the telecom system was very simple and antiquated, and you had a landline, and you had a very limited choice in terms of your options. And then it was revolutionized, and it became a network, and fiber was laid and so on. And now it's like a skeleton that you can hang different technologies off: voice over IP, cell, landline, fax lines, internet, and so on. And he said that's where we're going with the grid in Canada. In 5 or 10 years, we will have that new structure, and then you can integrate all sorts of gas and hydro and wind and solar and tidal and whatever you want, and the grid will be able to handle all of that. What's your take on that?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think one of the trends that we clearly see is a rapid diversification within the electricity grid. So, we're moving away from, we're going to have these big standalone plants built along transmission lines. Now you're much more diverse set of sources of electricity generation. You also have demand side players now much more active in how we manage the electricity grid going forward. And a multitude of scales. It's from a few solar panels on the house, making a contribution to a several 100 megawatt, wind farm, for example. So all of that sort of diversity represents a tremendous opportunity and can provide tremendous resiliency for the system if it is all connected and interacting together. And that's where, so for example, this discussion we had earlier about traditionally thinking about a distribution system and a transmission system, and they kind of live in two different worlds, that barrier's got to break down, right? We need to be able to see across that and be able to use all of the different tools, demand and supply side, on both ends there to ensure that we're getting the most efficient and effective system in place.
What about residential solar? And again, Lazard says that it's still quite expensive. I think about $150, maybe $115 a megawatt hour. Do you see a future for residential solar in Canada?
Yes, certainly. In part because costs will continue to come down, in part because customers are going to demand it, I think, at the end of the day. And, I think with policies in place that allow for net metering, virtual net metering, third-party ownership of net metering, things that, again, provide more flexibility in terms of how that decentralized and distributed generation can actually play into the electricity grid, that will open up a whole range of options, which will also continue to drive costs down going forward. So yeah, no, I think it's definitely got a bright future and bright potential. And again, in Canada, we're a bit behind, I think, some other countries, Australia or the United States, in this regard, but we have a lot of potential to capture.
This will be the last question. So if folks, if you can If you have a question, if you can raise your little blue hand, and then I'll be ready when Robert's finished his answer, and we'll call on you. Robert, if you could give us maybe the top 1 or 2 policy issues that Canada has to grapple with.
I mean, I would start first off by saying that we need some clarity around climate policy going forward in terms of what are the long-term objectives we're trying to achieve. So, I mean, we have a federal government that's now talked about moving to net zero by 2050. What does that mean? Have all the provinces bought in? That's important in terms of shaping some of the decisions that we will take going forward. And, you know, I would argue if you're serious about climate policy, that means you're also serious about carbon pricing. That also plays into the role as well. And within the electricity sector, specifically, I think it's really a matter of ensuring, first off, that we seek to enhance collaboration. First off, we have 10 very unique and distinct electricity grids in Canada. We seek to optimize each of them, and the net result that comes out of that is we have a suboptimal national grid. And so are there ways that we can enhance collaboration and move forward in that regard? Are there ways that we can ensure that we're more or better positioned to respond to the demands of customers going forward? Because we're seeing a significant shift in terms of customer engagement and interest in the sector. Can we design our electricity policy frameworks to enable that and facilitate that? And at the end of the day, I think electrification, which we've talked about earlier, is going to be really, really important. Obviously for our industry, but more importantly, for addressing the climate challenges that we face going forward.
I thought this would happen. Our first 2 questions are from engineers. So I'm very curious to see what Dave and Matthew will ask. So Dave Patterson, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Hi, very interesting so far. I'm wondering, there's a number of large gigawatt and larger battery storage projects going on in the States to either, you know, replace peaking units or, you know, buffer solar. I'm wondering if you're seeing any sign of that happening in Canada, especially around replacing, you know, the rolling reserve or peaking units.
There's certainly interest in exploring that opportunity. I think there's, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think the challenge is that our electricity market rules are not set up yet in such a way to facilitate easy access for those types of projects to come in and play that sort of role. Now, in Ontario, for example, I think is a jurisdiction which is increasingly interested in figuring out how storage can play an important role in helping to manage the grid going forward. And so there's a whole range of consultative processes now underway around market rules to try and facilitate the access for those technologies. But frankly, we are behind in that regard. The United States, the FERC did require now a couple of years ago each sort of electricity grid to establish rules for solar or for energy storage to enable its participation in the grid. Different jurisdictions are at different points in terms of enabling that. In Canada, we're a little bit behind. But I think everybody recognizes the role that storage can play in that regard and is keen to see that move forward. But again, people will not invest unless they have a framework of market rules that they're comfortable, you know, provide some certainty around that investment going forward.
Okay, Matthew Klippenstein, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Thank you very much, Markham. Hi, Robert. Thank you very much. On the one, sorry, I'm in an office right now. I hope it's not too loud. The for the 100% clean grid in Canada, how would you approach Alberta and Saskatchewan? You know, we do have 10 local grids. I could imagine it would be a lot easier for us to get to like 95, 98 on I appreciate that 100 is a great thing to aim for. Is it? I don't want to be a realist and cynical, but is it more realistic to say let's get to 95 and then target 98? Again, because transmission is huge, expensive, always delayed, and we have two fossil-based provinces.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. The Canadian Council on Renewable Electricity that we're a part of actually proposed setting targets of moving to 90% by 2030 and 95% by 2040. And then sort of where can we move beyond that to get to 2050? So yeah, whether it's 98.99 or 97.6 or something, I think is less important than that we're moving in that direction. And I think in a province like Alberta and Saskatchewan, will come down to increased use of the non-emitting resources that do exist within the province. So wind and solar are going to be important in that regard. But it will also rely on improved and increased interconnection with neighboring provinces, right? To access an abundance of resources, hydro resources primarily in that case. And you already see Saskatchewan and Manitoba taking some important steps in that regard. And there are further discussions there about how they can strengthen that collaboration going forward. So I spoke earlier about the need to sort of lift our head out of the bubble a little bit and to look cross-jurisdictionally to try and find ways that we can collaborate together to find lower cost solutions. And I think that will be an important component for provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick as well.
Robert, I have a quick question for you. We had Kingsmill Bond from Carbon Tracker on a few weeks ago, and he argued that one of the reasons we will see exponential growth in renewables is because it's not the percentage of market share that renewables will have, but it's that renewables are taking all of the growth. So if there's 1% or 1.5% or 2% of growth in power generation each year, renewables are taking all of that growth. What's your take on that?
Well, I think if you look at, I'll use the example of wind in Canada. You know, on one hand, you can say wind provides enough electricity today to meet 7% of Canada's electricity. You say, well, 7%, that's not such a big number. But as I said, over the last 10 years, there's been more wind installed capacity built than any other form of generation. So I think the point that was made there in terms of, it's not so much what's your percentage of the mix in absolute terms, it's what's your percentage of the new growth that's coming. And I do think that we will see these technologies dominate in terms of new additions because of their cost benefits. Having said that, in a country like Canada, where 60% of our electricity comes from hydro, it would be silly to imagine a scenario where, well, we're trying to see hydro turn into an incredibly small number, right? I mean, hydro has an important role to play and is going to continue to play an important role going forward. So I think there's, every electricity grid is different and unique in terms of its mix, but I think it really is a matter of where is the future growth coming from that's going to make a difference. And I think, again, that growth is going to be diverse. Wind and solar are going to play, I think, a central role, but they won't play the whole role. And it's not only going to be utility scale, it's also going to be behind the meter stuff as well. It's going to be a much more diverse sort of future than what we've seen in the past.
Dr. Joe Vipond, you're up next. Now, Joe is a executive with the Calgary Climate Hub, so I imagine he'll have an interesting question for you. So Joe, if you can unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Robert, good to hear your talk. My big concern is about markets and my sense that the markets are designed for an era that we no longer are going to be living in. I've heard the term renewables eating their own lunch, both with wind tending to go in the windiest spots, and therefore they all come on at the same time and come off at the same time. So there's a lack of geographic diversification due to that trend, and also that solar also eats its own lunch, and that's when it all comes online. Prices drop, and therefore there's not the incentive to bring new solar on at a certain point because you're just going to get power at the same time as everybody else is getting power. So can you speak to what you want out of market change so that we can avoid this spiral of doom?
So yeah, thanks, Joe. A couple points, I guess. First, in response to the first question about geographic diversity, um, I mean, that comes back to the question of interconnectedness. And I think what we will find is that the more interconnected the system is, the easier it is to manage variability, to ensure that you have that diversity. I mean, it's more challenging in Canada because it's a big country, admittedly, but the amount of, for example, interties that we have connecting different regions within Canada, or even within a region in Canada, is minuscule compared to what we have with the US, for example. So there's a lot we could do in that regard. You're absolutely right that one of the interesting challenges, I guess, that's being faced is because in market systems where people are bidding in to the market and are for if you have a variable generation source like wind and solar, you want to bid in when you have that generating, because you do that. So you bid low, you go in, you drive costs down. These are lower cost technologies. Tremendous benefit for consumers as costs come down. But it is absolutely true that you can end up in a scenario then where the cost drives down so far that you reduce the incentive to actually move forward and generate. And so there are, one way to address that potentially is by providing revenue streams in addition to the traditional market. So that could be environmental attributes. So in Alberta, that's happening through the tier system, where renewable energy technologies can sell credits or offsets because of the environmental attributes they're bringing to the system. It can be a whole range of other ancillary services that technologies bring into the grid. It was long thought that renewables would only sort of cause a burden to the grid, but there are many ancillary services that wind and solar can provide to the grid that they can actually provide more cost effectively than conventional generation. And it's a matter of being able to allow to participate in those markets and to gain value for providing those services. So a lot of the discussion you hear within the renewables sector is about revenue diversification, right? Where you're not solely reliant on the sales of the energy in the energy market, but recognizing all of the other services that you're providing to the grid and being able to secure compensation for them. And that's not just for renewables, that can be for everybody. And frankly, it will be increasingly important for everybody as renewables come on, energy costs fall. It's not just renewables then that can draw less from the market for its sale of energy, it's everybody who's drawing less. And therefore, there's a need to ensure that we're looking and valuing the full range of services that these technologies can provide.
Robert, could you give us a couple of examples of services to the grid provided by wind and solar?
Yeah, I mean, it's stuff like in terms of frequency modulation or frequency regulation. It's in terms of, there's an opportunity, for example, for wind energy to curtail down, right? To be able to, if it's generating, it can quickly move down if to reduce generation, for example. Some technologies are incented for being able to ramp up quickly. Wind energy can't do that because it's dependent on the wind conditions. But if the wind is blowing, it can come down very quickly and can do that much more efficiently than others. So there are services like that that we can provide. And in some jurisdictions, all of these services are sort of subject to market forces. In other jurisdictions, a system operator just simply assumes that's part of the deal. We're not compensating you separately. This is you get to play in the market. We just expect that. But I think, again, as the value from the energy market itself declines, I think you're starting to see more and more system operators sort of looking and saying, okay, well, we need to actually clearly define these other services and allow generators to secure value for them.
Dave Patterson, you're up next. If you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Hi again. I'm wondering what's happening with regards to geothermal for power generation in Canada. Is there anything happening?
So I won't speak out of turn because I can't say that I'm well versed in that. What I can say is that I think we're certainly seeing heightened interest again in geothermal technology, partially driven by an oil and gas industry looking to diversify and find new opportunities, and partially driven by climate considerations and looking for ways to essentially produce lower or no emission electricity. So it's an area where I think you're starting to see growing interest, but I can't speak to it in any detail.
Okay, Dave Juice, you're up next. If you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Hi, great presentation, thank you. Some of the ornithologists, entomologists have expressed concerns with wind turbines over bird populations, insect populations. Now, I've only saw one, I think it was from U of M. We do have a decent wind farm in southern Manitoba, and they basically said, no, there's nothing. We have not found anything beyond with the bird sort of thing. Is it real? Is it imagined? If it is real, what are some mitigation things you think people can do with it?
So I think, I mean, there's, it's clearly true that wind turbines do have an impact on avian wildlife. I think it's also important to put that into context. I mean, you can see Environment Canada has produced a study that sort of looks at what are the causes of mortality in birds, and you'll find a long list of things of which wind turbines are way, way, way near the bottom, because ahead of that you're going to have transmission towers, high rises, traffic, apps, everything like that. Having said that, I think the wind industry has actually been very good at sort of working with others to try and find ways to mitigate. There are requirements in place. So if you're building a wind farm, you're doing all sorts of pre-construction monitoring surveys and understanding what the bird population is there before you're up. You're doing post-construction monitoring. And if there are impacts that are being shown, you're going to be asked to say, maybe you don't produce energy at a certain part of time where there's a migratory period going on or things like this. But overall, in a relative sense, the impacts are relatively modest, I guess, compared to other things. But I think we have done things as an industry. For example, bats is another area where there's been a lot of discussion. The industry has partnered with Bat Conservation International to explore opportunities for mitigation strategies. There is a group called the American Wind Wildlife Institute, which brings together industry members and environmental organizations. They jointly fund a research agenda to look at ways to mitigate and moderate the impact of wind turbines on avian wildlife. So I think it's an area of ongoing research and work that's underway. But I guess I would say that it's well understood, and for that reason, it's actually well monitored. And every jurisdiction has in place regulatory frameworks that allow them to take action if there are concerns that the impacts are sort of beyond what is considered acceptable.
Well, Robert, thank you very much for this. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to chat with us. A fascinating conversation, and we'll look forward to talking to you in the near future to get an update on where renewable energy is in Canada.
I very much appreciate the opportunity. Enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.